Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Impromptu Business Chat with me, Mark Curtis, and my sidekick,
James Lay.
Only joking, James. I think the audience know well by now that you are the real star of this show, aren't you?
Yeah, it's only a matter of time before I go solo. I've already warned you of that, Mark.
I'm really looking forward to today's show. This is our third interview, and we're going to get our teeth into a really, really serious topic today. Serious because it impacts on all of us, and it can quite literally be a matter of life and death. So that topic that I want us to talk about today is mental health and well-being. So James, this is always a massive topic, and given what we're facing with the ongoing pandemic, it's probably even more relevant than ever.
I'm super excited about this episode. It's so relevant to us as individuals, but also for our teams around us in our work environment, but also our friends and family as well. I think, we can pick out bits and pieces in here that we can really use going forward. So I'm really excited by it.
Yeah, and James, this is a topic that we're both passionate about as well, and we want to make a difference. And I think if we just cast our minds back to episode 5 in season 1, which was called Stress, Drugs and Leadership Roles, and that was all about us just trying to give some guidance on helping leaders with their well-being. So we've tried to tackle this a bit, but as you say, today we're going to go to the next level on this interview. Now we are, as you say, conscious that we're just mere amateurs in this field, and it's an area whilst we probably try our best, we felt that the listeners deserved to hear from someone who's top notch on this and someone who can bring some real value to the table. So the person we're about to talk to has a master's degree from Cambridge University. So James, even if we put our combined brain power together, we're going to come up well short. Although I think you've got a degree, James, but it was probably a polytechnic. So
you've not got one at all.
I haven't. I'm mere A level. You're right. Sorry, I bow to your superior qualification.
My degree is in transport management. That served me well in accounting, didn't it?
Transport management. Anyway, move on. They've been a research scientist. They've been part of a team which was instrumental in the development and delivery of effective HIV treatment, a teacher, and now they specialise in supporting businesses and their with mental health support and training. So, what an amazing guest we've got today, James. The guest we have for you today, everybody, is Louise Newby from 3 Eggs Training. Welcome, Louise.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining us on today's show.
Louise.
Hello.
Now, listeners, I think one of the most amazing things is that Louise actually told us that she's listened to some of our other podcasts, and she's still arrived today for the interview. So we're very grateful, Louise. Thank you.
No, I've been very impressed with the stuff that you've done so far. So I was very honoured that you invited me on.
Well, and that's high praise indeed from someone with a master's degree from Cambridge. Thank you. So we've given the listeners a little bit of a taster of who you are, but please feel free to share a bit more about yourself.
Okay, so as you said, my name's Louise Newby and I run a company called 3 Eggs. I'm responsible for the training and development part of the company. What we do at 3 Eggs is provide a complete end-to-end wellbeing solution for businesses. So we support their teams with mental health training, we provide advice to their HR professionals. We've also got a clinical psychologist on our team, so we provide direct access to the clinical psychologist. And we've also got specific and tailored support for senior leaders, so that what we're doing is trying to improve mental health and create a positive mental health culture across the whole organisation.
And you service clients across the UK?
Yes, that's right. Yes. We started out locally in East Anglia, but actually, because of what's happened this year, we've realised that we can go further than that. So it's actually been quite positive in that respect, and we've gone further afield.
So I'd imagine over, certainly since March, maybe before then, but over the summer months in particular, there's been a big change with COVID-19 and the restrictions that have kicked in. What have you seen that's changed? This show is designed around business leaders and their teams. I'm sure you're dealing with businesses all the time. What are the headlines that you're seeing at the moment? What change have you seen in 2020?
So I think one of the big things, and perhaps something that some organisations haven't necessarily reacted to quickly enough, is the particular pressure that senior leaders, team leaders, managers have faced this year. Managing teams remotely has taken a huge toll on managers in terms of stress and anxiety because they're having to support people who are working from home. That was obviously a lot more challenging earlier in the year for people in particular who have got young children because they were having to homeschool them alongside their jobs. So that's improved. But I think it's really important that businesses understand and notice the specific stresses that leaders have been placed under and provide them with ongoing support as we go through the next months.
It's interesting, isn't it, Louise? Because perhaps there was almost a stigma attached to home working by some people sort of going into lockdown. There was a feeling by some that, if you were working from home, that you were perhaps, not working as hard as you might be in the office. And now we've gone sort of full circle in many businesses where, some are back in the office, but many people are still working from home and doing it very efficiently and proving it can be done that way. But there are subtle differences, aren't there? And I completely understand where you're coming from in terms of not seeing your team face to face and being able to keep just sort of an occasional eye on their body language and things that you might do in the office is a real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And we're social creatures, aren't we? We feed off that human interaction, which has been taken away from a lot of people. And it's probably not so bad if you live at home with a family, but you could well be someone in their 20s who perhaps lives on their own. And it's recognising the different situations that people are in and how that might be causing them greater stress and anxiety and how you detect that and pick up on it.
So it sounds like things have changed. Leaders, senior teams are having to deal with things completely differently to how they did before, including themselves as well. So bearing in mind all of these changes, Louise, what would you think are the biggest opportunities and possibly challenges as well, which are going to face businesses going forwards from here on in terms of sort of mental health of the leaders and the teams?
Well, actually, and this might seem a little bit backwards, but a huge opportunity is that we've now got a great number of people who've never experienced challenges with their mental health before, experiencing mental health challenges. So there was a recent report from the Centre of Mental Health where they estimated that an additional 500,000 people will experience mental illness as a consequence of COVID-19. And that's an opportunity because one of the biggest barriers to organisations providing support for people with mental health is the stigma that's so often associated with it. So now that so many more people have experienced mental health, I think they'll have a better understanding from their own first-hand experience of what that feels like. And I'm hoping that means that we can break that stigma down even more. We're starting to do that, and you can definitely see a change. But once you've experienced it and understood it from the inside, I think that's a huge driver for breaking down that stigma. But the challenge of that, obviously, is then providing enough support for the numbers of people who are going to need it. And that doesn't just mean professional support for people who need medical help, but it's helping people in the very early stages who are struggling with their mental health and getting support for them in place, perhaps through workplace schemes, so that they can help to get themselves better before they get to a more serious stage of their illness.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I know from a mental health training course I was on a few years ago, that they sort of said the old way used to be you went to the doctors and the doctor signed you off for 2 weeks, and they were saying actually that can very often be the most counterproductive way to go because someone then becomes isolated for 2 weeks, the stigma builds up. They're worried about what their colleagues are thinking, and actually there becomes more barriers about getting back into the normal job and the normal routine again. So yeah, it sounds like there's, as you say, there's a lot that can be done to stop going down the direct sort of GP route. There's much more preventative things that can be happening as well.
Yeah, I agree. That's right. And we know that good work is good for mental health. So actually keeping people in work is a good thing. And if we can do that by supporting them, then that's going to help their mental health.
So, Louise, how does a business leader look to successfully manage mental health in their organisation? What steps should they be taking?
Well, the most important thing is to make sure that mental health, good mental health, is advocated from the very top. I think historically we've all been quite scared of advocating top-down cultures for different initiatives within businesses, but actually for mental health it's absolutely important and vital, because if the leadership of an organisation is talking openly about and supports mental health across the whole organisation, then that's going to help to reinforce that message that within this company it's seen as a positive to talk about your mental health. It's not something that's going to be held against you. So one way to do that, and a really positive step that leaders can take, is to talk about their own mental health and to acknowledge that during our lives, we'll all experience challenges with our mental health, and that's okay. That's part of life. They can share how they got support for their own mental health issues, how they got through a challenging time, and then in time, experiencing and managing your mental health can be seen as a positive attribute rather than a weakness, something that demonstrates resilience and strength in the workplace rather than the weakness that it can have had in the past. The next thing is to make sure that everybody within the organisation receives training to help them understand the signs and symptoms of poor mental health. That might be through a workshop, for example, or you might provide more in-depth courses to train people to be a mental health first aider or a wellbeing champion. But having people from all levels of the organisation trained means that everybody is bought into this concept that within this company, mental health is really, really important. And that goes alongside this idea that if senior leaders aren't happy to have conversations about mental health, then don't ask someone how they are. I was at a Mental Health World Summit a couple of weeks ago, and one of the speakers was John Amici, the legendary basketball player. After his basketball career ended, he retrained as a clinical psychologist. And he said exactly that. He said, if you aren't prepared to discuss the answer, don't even bother asking the question. And one of our key aims at 3eggs is to get everyone feeling comfortable enough to both ask the question, but also handle the answer. Because we see so many situations where people have been trained to ask the question, but they haven't had that ongoing support to be able to handle the answer effectively. Another really important thing is emphasising to people that poor health can be improved. I think historically, a lot of people have the belief that there's nothing that can be done to help people with mental health issues. And that's simply not true. There's a great deal that can be done. And there are steps that can be taken to help people to get better from mental health issues. So that's a really important message, that it's not some desperate situation that's never going to get better. And that means that people then can stay at work and stay in work in a positive way as well. Something else businesses can do is to try to keep the mental health conversation going. So we see in a lot of organisations that mental health first aiders are trained, they get their certificate, and then that's it. We think that the training of a mental health first aider is the very first step that a company takes. Once they've trained their mental health first aider, we then work alongside them throughout the coming months and years in some cases to support them, to give them advice on situations that they're encountering, and just to make sure that they're really having a positive impact in the workplace. People know who they are. I can't tell you the number of organisations we go to where we will say to somebody, well, you know that Joe Smith is the mental health first aider. Is he? Oh, I didn't know that. You know, you need to keep them as a very high profile person within the organisation who's constantly sending out information, perhaps having a mental health display area that they put changing information on it, and just keeping it front of mind. And for senior leaders, we'd recommend doing something like a reflective practice group where you get together a group of perhaps 4 or 5 of your most senior leaders with a clinical specialist to talk about the challenges that they're facing. This would be confidential discussion led by the clinical specialist so that it doesn't become a whinge fest with everybody moaning about the company, but a way to offload, to share and to learn from each other, to learn from other leaders within the organisation. And again, that's going to help to break down the stigma. And alongside and kind of wrapped around all of that is working with HR professionals. So within the company policies and procedures, mental health needs to be embedded. So in annual appraisals, mental health should be a question that's talked about. Within team meetings, mental health should be a question that's talked about. And people should be incentivised to do that within the business. And that can be led through HR. And I think ultimately what we're working towards is a situation where the whole organisation recognises that good mental health is the reason why that organisation is successful. Professor Alex Ednams, who works at the London Business School, has said that companies that treat their workers better do better. And he's published a whole wealth of evidence of that, listing the increased productivity of companies who treat mental health seriously and who then reap the rewards of that through their profits. And so we reinforce that with all of the organisations that we work for.
I mean, wow, there was so many great points coming out of that. And I can see on the screen here, James is nodding as well. And I see you vigorously scribbling things down, James. But I think one of the things which really jumped out at me there was when you were saying about getting over this thing that, you can adjust and do something about your where you sit on the mental health scale. It's no different really, is it, to say, I don't know, someone's physically unfit or they're maybe carrying a few pounds and they can't do anything about it, which we know is not true. So why would it be any different from a mental health point of view as well? And I suspect some of this is down to the individual, isn't it? How many people say, well, I've always been overweight. It's just how I am. It's how I'm wired. And if they're using the same language themselves around their own mental health, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? So some of this is actually saying, I don't want it to be like this. I want it to be different. And then maybe there's a separate question, which is I don't know how to do it. But that's where then the organisations have to come in to help people, isn't it? And work with people like yourselves to give people, like a training program sort of thing. This is how you lose a pound of weight this week. This is how you stabilise or improve your mental health. So that really stood out to me, that it just can't be a fixed position, can it? It is a movable position.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, it's such an important point. And I just think that's what a lot of people think, she's got depression. That's it. She'll always have depression. And that isn't true. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There's so much there. Mark's absolutely right. That answer, Louise, we could sort of spend a whole podcast on going through some of that stuff. I love the bit you talked about it being top down, and there's echoes there of the last interview session we did on diversity and respecting the workplace, and how that needs to come from the top down as well. So sort of there's some great similarities there, and I'm looking at that, and I'm sort of, I guess I'd like to think I'm taking positive steps myself. I'm going to be doing some mental health first aider training next week, so there's a couple of days worth of training there. But I see that as much for my own benefit as I do for others, because I think you mentioned earlier about sort of raising awareness and understanding the tools, so that can, and I think, hopefully I can be helpful to other people, but also in a way be helpful to myself. And I love that saying from John Amici there, in terms of how often do we ask how people are and skirt over it, and actually that you might get signs that maybe things are up, but you're too busy or you don't know how to handle it, and you just move on. And actually sometimes all you need to do is ask that question a second time, so how are you? And you get a mumble back, and no, come on, how are you really? And suddenly the floodgates can open, can't they? And we've got to be prepared and able to take that on at that point. So I'd encourage business leaders to take up that sort of mental health age first training. And you look at the benefits of it. I mean, wow, I completely agree. I think if you've got good mental health within your organisation, the chances are your retention rates are going to be higher. Mm-hmm. If you can look at numbers, then retention rate of staff is going to be high. Their productivity is going to be high. You're going to tend to be a more attractive proposition for candidates looking to join your business. And I'm sure you're right. The profits probably of the business, the turnover, the feel-good factor. I mean, at the end of the day, we all spend an awful lot of time at work, don't we? So why not enjoy it and not see it as anything else? So, wow, thank you, Louise.
Yeah,
I'm pleased we asked that question. Is it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. As you say, we could have a full podcast on that, couldn't we, James? And as you say, just and it's also just about that being. If people feel supported in anything, it doesn't have to be in a business. It's just generally, isn't it? If people feel supported, appreciated, that we're all on the same team, we're all in the same direction. It's open. People can be honest about things. People perform better. It's just the way we're wired as human beings, isn't it? We pretty much without exception respond well to positive praise, don't we? Very few people perform better by being ignored or pushed away, or it's just not the way we work as humans, is it? So yeah, some great points coming out of that. So Louise, I mentioned it in the intro that you have a master's degree from Cambridge, and interestingly, that's in education. So I'd just be interested to know a little bit more about sort of how that came about and what benefits it brings, and just sort of generally a little bit more around that, really.
Okay, so my career actually started out in science, and I began after I left university. I went to work for Merck Sharp and Dome at their Neuroscience Research Centre, which is just outside Harlow in Essex. When I was there, I was part of a team that was studying brain markers for depression. So from a personal point of view, it's really quite satisfying because I've kind of come full circle now, and I'm at the other end of mental health with the physical people. After I left Merck, I went to work for GlaxoSmithKline as part of their new products team, where I was the project manager responsible for launching novel HIV therapies around the world. And as part of that job, I had to provide training programs for medics within HIV in different countries around the world. And it rekindled something that I'd always thought about doing when I was at school, which was being a teacher. I grew up in Bury St Edmunds, and my teacher at my school, one of the teachers there, when I told him I wanted to become a teacher, he said, "No, don't do it. Go and do something where you'll earn a lot more money and it'll be a lot less stressful. Go and do something else." So I'd been off and done these other things. I loved working for Merck. I loved working for Glaxo. Had a great time, but I knew that teaching, I had to go and give it a go. So I went back to university and retrained as a science teacher, and then eventually became head of science at a secondary school in Suffolk. And it was during my time there that I first encountered a colleague with a mental health condition. I was head of department at the time, and I didn't know what to do. Talking about, having conversations with people and wanting to hear the answer, it took me a long time to ask her that first question, are you okay? And it turned out she wasn't. We had a chat. I wasn't sure if the things I'd said were going to help her or whether actually I'd said the wrong thing and it was going to make her feel worse. So I had conversations with colleagues at school, had I said the right thing? And the general consensus was to tell her to go to her GP, which is what I had done. But I felt I was shortchanging her. I felt I perhaps could have spoken to her sooner, and perhaps I could have offered more than just telling her, well, off you go to your GP. A couple of years later, I was asked to become part of the team trainee teachers at Cambridge after I'd finished my master's there. And as part of being on the lecturing team of that course, I encountered lots of new trainee teachers who were arriving with pre-existing mental health conditions. And again, I didn't really have any training to know how to help them. The PGCE year is a really, really tough year. And as well as those students who were arriving, I had, with pre-existing mental health conditions, I had students on the course who were developing stress, anxiety because of the consequences of doing that course. And all I could do was refer them to university counselling. And again, I just felt we should be doing more. We shouldn't be kind of palming them off to somebody else so soon. And I was talking to my business partner, George Bradley, about this. He'd worked in a business environment. And I said, what do you do? And he said it was exactly the same, that he'd got people working for him who were suffering with mental health conditions, just referring them to the GP. He didn't feel particularly comfortable with doing that. So we then started thinking, well, in an ideal world, what services would we want to provide people to support them with their mental health? And that's where we came up with the idea of 3 Eggs. So my role now, obviously, I lead the training and development part because I use my education experience to develop our training courses. But we've both had experience of managing people within the workplace. And then it does help to have a little bit of the science background as well.
Yeah, I mean, wow, what an amazing journey. And as you say, it's sort of almost gone full circle all the way around. And I can see how the education bit now ties in with everything you're doing, and I think it's a fascinating background you have, and all of those different threads have got to make you, if you like, more relevant when you're dealing with this, because you've been on both sides of the coin, you've seen it from so many different angles. I think, that's amazing. That's a really interesting backstory. Thank you.
So, Louise, one of the things you touched on earlier, you talked about the ability for people and the awareness that people can improve their mental health and it's not fixed. And Mark and I love this sort of growth mindset versus fixed mindset view. So this absolutely ties in. And there's lots of talk around resilience, I think, is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. I kind of see that as a slightly defensive word, if anything, resilience, bounce back ability. But that is, I guess, crucial to business leaders and their teams. So in your mind, what sort of traits, what distinguishes someone with good or bad resilience levels, and what can people do to improve that?
So I think one of the most important traits of somebody who's resilient is having positive self-esteem and confidence. That's obviously a lot easier said than done. So asking about how you improve that, it's something you really have to work on. And I think it's something a lot of people suffer from is a lack of self-esteem and not a very positive image of themselves. And a lot of people can be quite apologetic about their abilities. And I think, you find that particularly with women, they can often suffer from imposter syndrome where they don't feel they're good enough at what they're doing. If you don't have confidence in your own abilities, then it's going to be very hard for you to battle through the challenges that come up, because you'll constantly be thinking, but I'm not very good at this job, so I can't do that. I can't cope with an extra challenge. But that's about looking at the things that you have done successfully and having more confidence in your ability. Even if that means you kind of have to put a mask on. I know I've done that sometimes when I've had to go and do things and I've thought, I don't think I can do that. I'm not good enough to do that. And you have to have a talk with yourself and say, why can't I do that? Other people have done that. I can do that too. And that is just something I think that you really have to work at and work hard at. Another really important trait of resilient people is having an inner locus of control. So what I mean by that is that you feel that you're in control of your destiny rather than feeling that luck or fate has got something to do with it. So you're in the driving seat, you're in control of what you do next. This year, that will have been challenged a lot for a lot of people, because it can have felt at times that we have been totally out of control of our lives. And a way that resilient people will have dealt with this lack of control this year is to identify the things that they can control. So you could control, in most cases, where in your house you were going to work, and you could control when you were going to have your lunch, and you could control what hours you were going to work when you were working from home. So it's identifying the things you can control and not feeling overwhelmed by the things that you can't control. And people who display resilience will have responded positively to kind of that lack of control and thinking about ways they could change their situation. So there were pubs that switched really quickly to offering takeaway. And I would say that the landlords of those pubs probably had more resilient characters than the pubs that were closed down, because they were looking at, well, what can I do? What can I do in this situation? And that helps people to bounce back and kind of feel more positive. So alongside that is having an ability to react positively to change. You can do that by thinking about situations in the past where you've gone through change and you've reacted positively, or you were worried about it, but actually it turned out okay in the end. So think about past experiences and how you handled them, how you might have done them slightly differently. But it doesn't mean that you were wrong in the way you handled it before, but just looking at things that have happened in the past and how you can use those skills as you go forward.
I love that, Louise. And again, sort of reviewing that, there's a whole podcast in that as well. But the inner locus of control and not seeing yourself, perceiving yourself as a victim. Certainly there are things that are outside your control, but there are lots of things that aren't. And I sort of think of, the other extreme to that is if you ever come across a chap called Jocko Willink, who's an ex-Navy SEAL in the US, who has a book called Extreme Ownership, and he takes responsibility for absolutely everything. That is, anything he touches is his responsibility. If his team mess up, it's because he didn't train them properly. Everything comes back to him, and it's all designed around improving himself, because he'll find out what he could have done differently, but ultimately he doesn't feel a victim for anything. He takes responsibility for it. Perhaps he takes it too far, but that's that philosophy works very well for him. And I guess as well, I was listening in the bits you were talking about there about sort of reviewing past experiences and observing that we can get through it, because we've probably been through as difficult, if not harder, things in the past, and we're still here. And I mean, Susan Jeffers' sort of mantra around, whatever happens, I'll handle it sort of thing is so true, isn't it? Because, we've quite possibly faced bigger challenges than this, and we will find a way through if we take it one step at a time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, Louise, earlier on, you were sort of mentioning how actually it's quite culturally difficult to talk about some of this stuff, especially sort of senior people within organisations. And literally just before we came on to record the podcast today, I happened to be looking through LinkedIn, and there was a post which was on there where somebody they'd laid their soul bare. They were about to run a webinar for some very senior people. I think it was quite a large webinar, and they had complete capitulation on this live webinar, to the point where they couldn't deliver it. And and somebody on the webinar apparently asked, "Are you okay?" And they said, "No, I'm not okay." And all of these senior executives on this webinar then ended up having I don't know what the webinar was supposed to be on, but they actually ended up having a discussion between all of them about how all of them were not actually okay, and how in the last 7 months they'd had quite big episodes of not being okay. And it's about 50,000 likes of it already on LinkedIn. I was seeing, and people saying it was really refreshing, because all of a sudden everyone's a human being, and it was really supportive. There was no chastising this person who couldn't deliver it. It was very supportive, and I thought that just resonates so much with what you're talking about around there as well. So coming back to what I was then going to ask you before I rudely interrupted myself, it's a difficult thing to talk about. I think what would be quite interesting would almost be to maybe sort of share some of your own journey and some of the things you do, Louise, to manage and maintain your own mental health, if you'd be prepared to share some of that with us. And then equally, if you want to ask me and James, we'll open our souls as well.
Okay, no, and I think actually that backs up the bit you were just saying, that actually when people start talking, other people start talking too. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at 3 Eggs, is just get everybody talking, because everybody has a brain. And actually, most of the work that most people do these days requires their brain rather than their bodies. So, I'm very happy to talk about that. For me, and well, for every other human being, I would think sleep is really, really important. And it's often difficult to get enough sleep, especially if you've got children. Our son is autistic and he doesn't go to sleep very well, and he's 8, but he's often up in the night. And I can find myself sometimes, when we've had, a really difficult time, of becoming quite obsessed with the fact I'm not getting enough sleep. And I know the impact that has on me the next day when it comes to trying to work effectively. And actually, I learned something from Chris Evans on his radio show a couple of years ago, when he was talking about sleep quite a lot. I think he'd been suffering with his very early starts. And he talked about trying to embrace that moment in the night when you're not asleep, rather than fighting it. And I know that's something that I was doing. I was thinking, oh my goodness, it's 4 o'clock. I've only got 2 hours until I need to get up. I'm not going to have had enough sleep. And rather than doing that now, when I'm awake at 4, as I often am, I now just enjoy the fact that it's quiet and it's dark and I'm in a nice house with a warm bed. There are a lot of people in the world that aren't in that situation. And just that's helped me to relax and then usually fall back to sleep again. And if I don't, well, I've had 2 hours of just lying there, and that's lovely when you've got young children, because you don't often get to just lie there. So it's kind of changing your attitude around sleep if you aren't getting enough sleep, rather than kind of falling into a downward spiral of panicking that you don't get enough sleep. And I also find that getting outside is a really important thing to do. Having a dog is great for that. So I, really recommend getting a dog if you don't have one, because you have to go out. You've got to get out in the fresh air every day. And I think we're really lucky. I live in Suffolk and we're really close to the coast. So we can pop to Felixstowe or Aldborough at the weekend for a day and get out. And just looking at the sea, I find really, really helps me. So they're my 2 things really. Thinking about sleep, but not stressing about sleep, and also getting outside in the fresh air as often as you can.
Yeah, and the sleep one really resonates. I used to have exactly that same thing, where I'd wake up and then I'd fight it. And I ended up, I read a book by John Kabat-Zinn, Full Catastrophe Living. And within there, he talks about, he used to do exactly the same thing. And then now if he doesn't get back to sleep within sort of 5 minutes, he gets up, he meditates, he does a bit of yoga, and then he follows his routine that he would normally do before he goes to bed again, and then he goes back to bed at that point. And from a personal point of view, one of the things I did, I tried to use some post-hypnotic language on myself if it happened. So I keep telling myself, rather than saying, oh, I'm really annoyed I can't get to sleep, I just keep telling myself, I'm really sleepy, I'm really sleepy, I'm really sleepy. And then before I know it, I'm back asleep again. So you're right, there's things we can do, but getting angry about it and getting your cortisol levels up is definitely not going to help us get back to sleep.
No, that's right. Yeah, counterproductive.
I think on top of that, I love the exercise and the fresh air point. I may have mentioned in the past, Mark, but I'm quite a keen runner, and I see that as a great way of getting fresh air and getting out there. And it's almost a form of sort of meditation at the same time, because you can switch off and you're just focusing. You're in the now. You're just worrying about the next mile, the next step, the next hill, etc., etc. So I think that kind of, you can forget your problems for a little while in that period. And on top of that, I've mentioned before we went on air that I've started a cull on news and social media this week. I started on Saturday when I noticed that I caught myself out yet again looking at maybe the BBC News website and finding it hadn't really changed. The 30 minutes earlier that I checked the same thing, and every time it's bad news, and actually very little of it truly affects me directly. I'm very fortunate to say. So I kind of look at it and think there's just an avalanche of bad news that seems to be in the media, much of it focused around COVID. And I understand why, but it can be very depressing, can't it? And can impact on your mental health. And Louise, you were talking about the opportunity perhaps to present a good news story around COVID, which was lost by one of the news stations yourself.
Yeah, that's right. I'd done a similar thing to you. I used to be an absolute news addict. And then in August, we had the first day when there were no deaths from COVID, and that wasn't reported. And I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, the narrative here is all about doom and gloom and negativity. And it's an awful situation, but there are positive stories too, and they're not being reported. And actually, is it very helpful for me to keep watching all this negative stuff, and what can I do about it? So I've stopped watching the news. My husband thinks it's brilliant because I was a complete news addict. So he's finally got the TV back. But the positive side of that is that I now read before I go to bed, and that's something I stopped doing. I don't watch the 10 o'clock news, and I don't watch Newsnight, which was what I used to watch before I went to sleep. And then I'd go to sleep thinking, oh no, this is just awful. Now I'm reading, a nice book, and I think I sleep much better because of it. When I can stay asleep because of my son.
And I think whenever you're trying to change your habit, it's really good to have a substitute sort of habit to pick up. So one of the things, I'll be making a cup of tea and I put the kettle on, and maybe then I'll grab my phone. I'll just see what the latest headlines are or whatever. So now I'm using again the Duolingo app. So I'm trying to learn a language at the same time. Very, very bad.
English.
I'm doing it best. Very good, Mark.
Thanks.
So trying to use that time creatively and productively. And I think whenever we're trying to change behaviors, we've got to look at what it is that we're trying to move towards instead. As that makes it a little bit easier. So you've picked up a book, I've picked up Duolingo. Mark is still wasting his time watching the news every day. So join me.
But you know what, Liz? I think one of the biggest things that's helped with my overall mental health has been very much mindfulness. Specifically around that, it's the being present, it's being in the now. I tend to be a person, I don't dwell in the past very much. Once it's gone, it's gone. I don't live in the past. I never did particularly, but the area where I did tend to live, and I still do if I'm not careful, it's I just run scenarios. I'm in the future way too much of the time, and that just causes quite a lot of anxiety and stress if you live a lot of your life in the future about the what ifs all the while. It's useful to do a bit of it because that's called planning, but I was there too much of the time, and just the things you were saying, I love reading as well. And when you read, you've got to be present. That sentence, that paragraph, that page, and it just brings you back into the now, doesn't it? And again, it links in with that sleep thing, which is if you're anxious about something which is going to happen in the future, or dwelling on something which was happening in the past, you're not going to get to sleep. So to get to sleep, you've got to really be in the now and present. Otherwise, it's pretty impossible to switch off and go to sleep. So for me, I think finding techniques to keep myself in the present moment has been the biggest thing, or biggest things, because there's multiple things I can use to do that have helped with my mental health.
I think that idea of being in the now is really important. I've been reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah. Is it Tolle or Toll? I don't know.
Well, I don't.
It's Toll, isn't it?
It depends whether you come from Suffolk or Norfolk.
No, and that's it's exactly that, isn't it? And I'm exactly the same. Worrying about the future, worrying about things that have happened before, and actually, it's now that's important. And I was talking to my husband about this the other day. We have a lot of challenges at home with our son, and I said to him, "But I think when we're 90 and we're in an old people's flat on our own, we'll look back at this time and think, why did we spend all this time getting stressed and worried about him?" When actually these are the best years, having a young family and doing the things that families do. And we've got to enjoy now, because now is what's actually happening. And that's come from reading that book and recognising that. So, yeah, I think that's really important.
So You touched on a little bit there at sort of the back end of the day, but in terms of bringing this to life, Louise, I'm sure you practice what you preach. Talk us through like a typical working day and how you build sort of well-being into that.
So I tend to work in quite defined chunks, and I think that's probably a hangover from teaching because, of course, I was so used to working in 50-minute chunks punctuated by a ringing bell. So I kind of still work like that. So I'll do an hour and then I'll have a 5-minute break, and I make myself get up from my laptop. I won't quickly have a look at something else on the internet that's going on. I'll walk away and make a drink or, do something else, but make myself walk away from the laptop for 5 minutes because I know then the next hour will be more productive because of that.
Mark does things the other way around. He'll do 5 minutes of work and then he'll walk around for an hour.
Then he'll go off on his bike for an hour.
Sorry, Louise, carry on.
It doesn't always work as smoothly as that. Sometimes someone will phone just before I'm about to do that. But that's what I try to do because I think that makes my day more productive, and also I can cope better with things that are happening if I have those little breaks every now and again. And I always stop for lunch. I didn't used to do this. I used to just work straight through, particularly when I was at school, because you had to. And so now I make sure I do stop, even if it's just for 20 minutes. But something that I found really useful is I discovered yoga with Adrienne on YouTube.
I've tried that as well.
Have you? Yeah. So and what's great about her is all ages and all abilities. So there are no excuses there for people who, think they can't join in. And also she does a 10-minute one. So, who can't fit 10 minutes of yoga into their lunchtime? So, I try to do that. I'm not, making out I do it every day. I try to. That's what I always aim to try to do. And I think that's half the battle, isn't it, to try planning it in.
Building on to that, I think you've talked a little bit about your sort of evening routines and how you wind down in the evening ready for bed and such like. So do you have a morning routine? Is there anything you do to sort of prime your day and get ready for the day ahead?
I'm definitely a routine person, which I really am a routine person. I have to do the same things in the same order every day. Otherwise, things just don't work out. But I read a book earlier this year called My Morning Routine, and that's by Benjamin Spall and Michael Zander. And they interviewed loads of successful people from the US and the UK. And I think, James, that army person that you talked about, I'm pretty sure...
Jocko Willing, yeah.
Yeah, when you said the name.
He gets up at 4:30 every day.
Yeah, it was. That was him. Yeah. So when I read about these crazy routines that some people had, I realised I wasn't as bad as I thought I was. But I do that because I know what's coming next. I like to get my stuff done before the children are up. I like to quickly check my emails for work at that part of the day, because another difficulty that we have is actually getting our son to school. So once he's up, I have to just focus on him. But if I've already checked my emails, I can kind of be formulating my replies in the back of my mind while I'm getting him ready. And then once they're both at school, then I can kind of carry on with stuff. I definitely have a routine. But having read that book, I realised that's not such a bad thing after all. Lots of people have a strict routine in the morning.
Often I saw myself as not a morning person when I was younger, and you can sort of trick yourself into believing it. And I've probably switched around the other way. I'm much more active in the morning than I probably am in the evenings. But getting up and getting prepped for the day can, for me, make such a massive difference. Sort of win the morning, win the day, I think is the same, isn't it? So,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say, actually, is if I feel that everything's gone in the right order and it's, and I've had a little bit of thinking time as well, then my day gets off to a much better start than if it was this chaotic, random series of events. So
how do you manage your energy levels then? Because if you've had a decent night's sleep, that's a start.
Yeah.
but it's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? And I guess that also helps with resilience and well-being. So how do you go about that, Louise?
Well, I think it's interesting you saying about whether you're a morning person or not. And I know that I'm better in the morning. So I try to keep the tasks requiring the most brain power to the morning, which is why I then leave things that aren't so difficult for the afternoon or the evening, because I think it's about being kind to yourself, and we're not robots, we're humans, and we all work better at different times of the day. So there are times of the day when we don't perform as well as other times, and it's knowing when those times are, not beating yourself up about it and accommodating them into your day.
So one of the things we come across quite regularly, I think, with our teams and ourselves and certainly our clients, is that one of the key things which seems to weigh down on mental health is people being too busy and running around like headless chickens. From your point of view, Liz, you sound like you've got a pretty busy life, everything you can say, children, dogs, business. There's a lot going on in your life as well. So how do you manage your time? What would be your sort of top tips on managing time effectively to take some of those stresses away, which can have a detrimental impact on our well-being?
Well, my day is very definitely punctuated by the children. So I have a defined amount of time in which to work. And I think that actually helps because there isn't time to procrastinate. There isn't time to think, oh, this task, which should really take 20 minutes, it doesn't matter if it extends to an hour. So I think having that limit on how much time is actually available, it is a pressure, but you can turn that around to be a positive as well. And you can think, no, I've got 5 hours in this particular part of the day, and I'm going to get this and this done and get those things done within that amount of time. So that's something I've had to learn to accommodate. And there have been times in the past when I found it quite frustrating and thought, if only I had another couple of hours, but you don't. So you have to get done the work that you need to get done in the time that you've got, and trying to, I think that idea of chunking it down where I work as if I'm still punctuated by school bells helps, because I know I've got this amount of time for this task and then I'll move on to the next one. And I guess that comes from being quite a rigid routine sort of a person, and it wouldn't suit everybody, but it certainly works for me.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think you're right. We all have a tendency, if we're not careful, to fill the time we have and some available, and then we cause time pressure on ourselves, which is completely unnecessary. So just that little bit of discipline and focus can make a real difference.
It refers back to that Parkinson's law, doesn't it? Which is that sort of whatever job you've got and whatever time you've got, you'd expand the task to fit the time period. So
definitely,
often, work to a deadline, and chances are the produce, whether it be a report or whatever, will be just as good as something that you might have twice the amount of time for, because you just expand it out. So bring it back to the PAAP program then. What do you see as, tell us more about the challenges and the benefits of that program that you run with 3 Eggs.
So all of us at 3 Eggs have been on the receiving end of a traditional employee assistance program. And quite early on, when we were developing the business, we talked about that scruffy poster on the back of the toilet door that we'd seen when we'd worked within large organisations, with a helpline on it to phone if you were struggling.
We have them on our workplace.
There you go.
Well.
Yeah, there you go. That's where they're kept. But we didn't know anyone who'd ever phoned that helpline number. And we just felt that those schemes were probably, for most businesses, just a tick box exercise to say, look, we're providing some mental health support. We've put a poster on the back of a toilet door that tells you who to phone. And when we started investigating their use, we found that the average take-up of those schemes is just 1% of all employees in an organisation. And the success criteria for them is if 4% of employees are using them. And that just didn't make sense to us when we think that 1 in 4 people is suffering from a mental health condition at any one time. It should be at least 25% of your staff that are using them. So we started looking at why that was and why they weren't very successful. And using that, we then developed our proactive EAP. So that's about supporting individuals before they get to the stage of needing to phone the helpline number on the back of the toilet door. And we do that by going into an organisation and evaluating the current state of wellbeing. So we gather data on presenteeism and absenteeism and attrition, and we look at how that links to the employee wellbeing programmes that are already in existence within the organisation. And then we suggest a range of strategies that they can start using, or the organisation can start using, to demonstrate that commitment to their teams. So that might be through some of the things I've discussed earlier, like the workshops or the mental health first aider training or the reflective practice groups. It might be working with the HR department on their policies and procedures. We also provide a phone line for people to talk, but it's a proactive phone line. We want people to use it. We don't want the success of the business to be based on the small number of people contacting us. We want people phoning it. We want the mental health first aiders phoning and saying, hey, I did my training. I've got somebody in the office I'm worried about. Am I doing the right thing? And we'll help them with that. And we also provide appointments with a clinical psychologist that bypasses a GP referral, which can be really useful for your senior leaders in particular, because obviously it's a time issue a lot of the time for them. And at the heart of that is this thing I was talking about earlier, that mental wellbeing is just something that successful organisations do. It's not about just providing a bit of advice from a charity or looking up some free resources on the internet. if that's all your organisation is doing, then what does that tell your employees about really how seriously you're taking this issue? It's not about telling everyone to use an app on their phone, which can be a really lonely experience. It's about saying we're successful, and we know that's because we value the people who work for us, and we value them enough to invest properly in their well-being, and then showing them how you're supporting them because you understand that good work is good for mental health. It's about creating an EAP that's fit for purpose, and it's proactive because you actually want people to use it and use that resource that you've invested in.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because how much money, I look at our own organisation, for instance, and we spend an awful lot of money on technically training our teams. We bring on many trainees every year. We have ongoing professional training for our qualified staff. That's all sort of honing their skills from a professional level. But what proportion does the average business then spend on the mental well-being, which underpins, if you can have all the technical skills, but if you're not in work, then it's all lost, isn't it? And so this is fundamental. And yet I think we're very good at it. Personally at MHA Larkin Gowan, but there must be many organisations where that balance is not quite there, and there must be implications then on those people and the business itself. So
yeah, that's right.
And James, your point about where they're located in our building, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but in the gents, they are only on the back of the cubicle doors. So is there any scientific link between people going and having a number 2 at work and needing to phone one? Because there's none near the urinals. James.
And again, that's reinforcing stigma, isn't it? Because it's saying if you've got a mental health condition, you want to hide it. You want to be hidden in a toilet cubicle, secretly writing that number down or putting it into your mobile phone to phone later.
Exactly the top-down culture that you were referring
to. Exactly. It's just, it makes me want to cry, And what other part of your organisation would you just go to a charity to get advice from? There's a lot of talk about promoting positive mental health within workplaces and a lot of tokenistic gestures. But actually, to do it properly, you need to invest and you need to demonstrate that you really do see it as a priority. Otherwise, it's not helping anybody.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So Louise, you mentioned a book earlier, and the next thing I'd just be interested to know is if you were going to recommend 3 books or films which really help leaders around mental health, well-being, etc., what would they be? Would one of the one you've already mentioned be part of that? If it doesn't have to be?
No, there's actually 3 others. I'm quite keen on books now. I don't watch the news anymore. I've managed to up my reading list. So the first one I'd recommend is called Mental Health and Wellbeing in the Workplace. It's by 2 ladies called Jill Hassan and Donna Butler. It was only published this year, and it's just an excellent guide to mental health, workplace mental health for both employers and employees. And it's a really good overview of the kind of situations you might encounter and the kind of things that you can do to make things better. So if you're just starting out on your journey of workplace mental health, or you want to check in about what you're doing and think whether you're going along the right lines, I'd really recommend that for everybody, employees and employers. Another one that I keep going back to is called A Mind for Business. And that's by Andy Gibson, who developed the Mind Apples training program, which is used by lots of global companies to improve staff performance. I really like it because it's all backed up by scientific research, and he references all of the work that he's drawn on. And it demonstrates really simply how making time for your mind and understanding how to value your mental resources is the key to successful business. And that's why so many big companies have used Andy's work to help them. So that's a really good one as well. And then people may or may not be aware that Ruby Wax has suffered from depression throughout her life. And when her comedy career came to an end, she actually went to Oxford and studied a master's in mindfulness, which you two would be interested in because I know you're both keen on mindfulness. And a recent book that she wrote is called Sane New World. And it's excellent because she talks about physical structures in the brain and how they're impacted when you have a mental health condition. And she also talks about why modern life in particular is causing so many mental health challenges for people compared to previous generations. And she gives a really useful piece of advice for people suffering from mental health conditions, which is that if you're suffering, find someone else who's suffering too, because they will get it and they'll understand and you can help each other. It's helpful to talk to people who, perhaps if you have depression, to talk to someone who doesn't suffer, but they might get bored. And I think that's often what happens. People start out by being sympathetic and kind, but if they don't get it and they haven't experienced it, they won't necessarily be the long-term support that can be helpful to you. So she really recommends finding someone, perhaps your online groups or something like that, who can be a buddy for you if you're suffering from something like depression. And I think it's also a really useful book for anyone out there who's skeptical about mental health. And there are many people out there who are still skeptical about whether this is a real thing or not. And I think using comedy, she explains why this is a real thing and it's not something that's made up, and it is something that does need to be taken seriously. So I think it's a really good introduction to mental health for people who haven't experienced mental health conditions, to help them understand what it's like, but also a very supportive book for people who are suffering from a mental health condition themselves. So yeah, all three of those are really useful.
They're three great books. And the last book there, I haven't read that. I'm going to add that to my list. I was going to say it's funny, but that's the wrong word. It's ironic, isn't it, that there's a comedian there with depression and you think of Robin Williams.
I was going to say that.
I hope I'm right here because I'm going to name people, but Frank Skinner, I think, has talked about depression in the past. I think recently John Bishop might have been saying things as well. Jason Manford talked about it. That just off the top of my head. You talked about playing a role for your job. But and no doubt these people are doing the same things. But even though they're on the face of it, they're funny and they're, you think that they're going to be life and soul and happy people. That doesn't necessarily translate, does it? And
no,
it's just a real lesson for us all, I'm sure.
And the bit you were saying there, Louise, about in Ruby Wax's book about finding like-minded kindred spirits to be able to work with. I think James, we probably recognise that. Depression is a big word. I think we all have mental health on a scale. It goes up and down. And just because we're a couple of successful podcasters doesn't mean we're immune to this kind of stuff. But, generally we have
comedian now, Mark.
Yeah, but we have the normal life pressures. We have the pressures of running, being owners of MHA Larkin Gowan as well. And we found a kindred spirit in terms of being open, and we talk to each other, don't we, James? And especially through lockdown, it's been invaluable. Just not for any other reason than you've just got someone who you feel comfortable sharing stuff with, who's not going to judge you, who's not going to kind of, well, he sometimes switches the camera off, but broadly supportive. And that human connection is really important. So I completely, that really resonated. I got that. Yeah, thank you. So three great books. Yeah. So James, as you say, we'll get those on our reading list. I haven't actually read any of those three, so I'm looking forward to having a read of those.
And in terms of sort of, we talked about positivity and resilience. Do you have any sort of mantras or affirmations that you regularly tell yourself, either sort of consciously, deliberately, or maybe that just sort of pop up when you're going through difficult times, or you're trying to prep yourself for the day, or you're coming up with a meeting or things? What things do you tell yourself?
Well, something I've been trying to do this year is I've been joining in with the what three things affirmation that lots of people have been doing, where you, at the end of the day, you try to think of three things that you're grateful for. And I've been surprised by how positive that has made me feel, particularly when I've had difficult days, forcing myself to think about, actually, this was good, that was good, and that was brilliant. I think too often we just keep, we're swept along week to week, aren't we? We don't stop to think about good things sometimes. And I found that a really, really useful thing to do. And I guess that links to going back to the Power of Now book that we were talking about, and really trying to just think about now and what's happening right now and what am I grateful for right now. And I think I've surprised myself by the impact that has had on me.
Great way to build that self-esteem that you talked about earlier, wasn't it? Of sort of reinforcing the victories you've had in the day.
Yeah.
How many times do we get a test result through or something and we've got 99 corrects and one wrong? Well, not in Mark's case very often, but and you focus in on the one thing you got wrong. You got 99 things correct, and yet sort of your attention is focused in the wrong area. So I love the gratitude thing. I do the same thing. I journal in the mornings. I don't tend to do it in the evenings. Maybe I should, but I'll focus in on three things I'm grateful for each day. and try and make sure that they're different and they're fresh each time. And, it leads to that abundance mentality almost, doesn't it? That, there is plenty of good stuff going on. We just got to make sure we're focusing on the right stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do a similar thing, as you know, James. I tend to do my journaling in the evening. And the gratitude, the thing that has amazed me coming out of the gratitude element of my journaling is there's very few big ticket things in there. I mean, it's just the simple things. It's almost the sort of just the things which don't really cost any money. They're the things that I'm most grateful for. Whether it just be, and when you, like you say, you're having days where maybe it's not been a great day, and you're standing there and you turn the tap on, you've got a nice glass of cold water, and it's like, or maybe a cold beer, it's a fridge, but cold water, and you think, my word, how lucky am I to be able to turn a tap on, have fresh, clean, safe water, and all I've had to do is just turn a tap on. I haven't had to walk anywhere apart from to the cupboard to get a glass, and just something like that makes you feel humble as well, but really grateful for what you really do have, those things we take for granted. So I think all three of us are completely on the same page on that one. Thank you. So Louise, final question you'll be pleased to hear. Then you can go get on with your evening routine.
Dismissed.
Ding, ding, we'll ring the bell for you. So the final question, we're going to ask all our guests on all our interview podcasts this one, which is, if you could talk to yourself as say an 18-year-old, what 3 pieces of advice would you give yourself if you were talking to yourself now?
Okay, well, I think the first one would be that things usually turn out okay in the end. There have been loads of times when something has seemed like a disaster, either with work or, things in your personal life, buying a house and things just going wrong. But actually, they've all turned out okay. And when things haven't seemed like they're going along the path you thought they were going to go along, actually things then happen and it is okay in the end. By staying positive and focusing on the end result, actually it does work out okay. So I guess it's that don't sweat the small stuff, isn't it? It's trying not to worry, because it will be okay if you stay positive and you focus on what it is you want to achieve. And quite a big one for me is not worrying about what others think of you. And I know loads of people talk about this, and I agree that it does get easier as you get older. But at 18, I worried so much about what other people thought of me. I was such a geek at school, and I was so conscious of not being in the cool gang. But I look at those people who are in the cool gang now, and I wouldn't want to be one of them, and I don't understand now why I was so desperate to be one of them, because actually being a geek has served me really well in life. So I'm really glad that I was one of the geeks and I wasn't in the cool gang. And I would tell myself to take vitamin D. I always knew that vitamin D was really important and we didn't get enough of it, but there just wasn't enough scientific evidence around all those years ago. But there's so much evidence now that vitamin D is really important for so many functions, and also especially for mental health. So I think, at 18, I wish I'd started taking vitamin D, because you never know what could have happened if I'd been supplementing with vitamin D back then. But yeah,
that's
really important.
So quick supplementary question. Do you think you'd listen to yourself?
Probably not. I don't think 18-year-olds listen to anyone, do they? It's funny, when I was teaching at school, I used to get my sixth formers who were starting the second year of their A-levels. I would get them all to write a letter to somebody in the lower sixth who was just beginning their A-levels, and I'd get them to write dear and leave a blank, because then I'd say we're going to choose who they send it to. And I used to say, write this letter to someone in the lower sixth telling them what you wish you'd learnt and what you wish you'd known a year ago when you started, and how they can make a success of their A-levels. So they would all write this letter, and then I'd say, right, these are the people you're going to send them to. And I'd get them to write their own name on the letter, because I used to say, actually, you've still got another year. These are the things you can do to still achieve. So yeah, they listen to themselves, but they wouldn't have listened to me.
Yeah. Well, Louise, thank you ever so. I mean, that has been amazing, hasn't it, James? Wow, we've covered so much ground. The knowledge and input and practical tips you've brought out for our listeners has been amazing. So thank you so much once again for giving up more time than we said we were going to take up, but we couldn't help but run on a bit further, because this has just been, it's just too important to cut short. So thank you for your time. So if there's anything we can ever do to help you, we'd be grateful to do it after what you've done for us today. So thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Louise. And where can listeners track you down? Have you got website address and LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that?
Yeah, that's right. So our website address is 3eggs.co.uk. So 3 is the word 3, and eggs is like the things that chickens lay, not the letter. So that's our website. And yes, I'm on LinkedIn, Louise Newby, and we're on Twitter at Eggs Training. We've also got Instagram as well. So yeah, you can find us on all the different platforms.
It's enough options there, isn't
Yeah.
it? I echo what Mark said. It's been great.
And we'll get those in the show notes as well. So if anyone, if this stuff has resonated with people today, and you want to reach out to Louise, then the contact details are all going to be in the show notes. So hopefully that will be a benefit to the listeners as well. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you. It's been great, and I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Pleasure. Thank you, Louise.
Well, James, so much covered there. But in normal style, we are going to try and pick out the 3 things which really, really resonated with us in this. It's going to be a tough one because there could be a lot of things, but we're going to distill it to 3. So over to you, James. What's the first thing that really stood out for you in what Louise was saying?
Yeah, some great content in there. It's hard to bring it down to 3 points. I think for me, we've already touched on it a couple of times in that session, but the importance of this being a top-down initiative, I think really resonated with me. It's important for business leaders to show genuine interest in the well-being of themselves and their teams. And it sounds as though, from what Louise is saying, there's an air of sort of vulnerability as well at the top. We need to share our own experiences and show how, as business leaders, we've got through the more difficult times as well, because we're not isolated from this sort of thing. So I think by doing that, it's then important not just to pay lip service to this, actually get some proper professional support in there, get some initiatives going. Louise talked about workshops. She talked about the mental health first aiders programs and getting those people introduced into your organization, trained up. The ideas around the senior leader reflective practice groups, that sounds great. You can have formal or informal versions of that, I'm sure, within organizations, and just sort of embedding it into appraisals and things like that. So we're really understanding where people are at, because it's quite clear that the advantages to the business in the long term of looking after your teams it's going to fall to bottom line as well as the great thing about looking after our teams as well. So
yeah, and that's a great point, James, isn't it? It's too many egos at play a lot of the time in businesses. So showing that vulnerability.
It's making sure that we look at this as an investment rather than a cost. I think that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, and ironically, I suspect if we don't invest as businesses, then it will become a cost.
Absolutely.
Okay, great point, James. Yeah. Coming back to me for the second one, I think if I was going to put it into a nutshell, sort of summarising quite a few of the points Louise was talking about, I think it's talk to somebody. I think she was saying the importance of just sharing and talking about this as well, and not hiding it away, not making it a stigmatised area, which links in with your first point. If it's top down and there's a culture in the organisation that it's okay to talk about it, it's okay to show some vulnerability, then it means people are going to be more open to talk about it as well. But just because this stuff is available doesn't mean people are using it. And I think that a fascinating stat there, wasn't it, where Louise said that for the businesses that have some sort of EAS type program in place, then is it 1%, did she say? 1% utilization, which, and she said actually at any one point in time, 25% of your organization statistically are going to be having some mental health difficulties. So there's a massive gap there, which means it's not embedded culturally, or it's too reactive, or there's something not working within that program, isn't there? So I think, it's just about talking to somebody and using the resources that we have available within our businesses for us and our teams to kind of truly talk about this stuff. And I think Louise was talking about it much more on a preemptive front, which is just talk to somebody. Don't wait until it gets to a point where it's kind of got further down the line. Just start talking to somebody and use these resources to do it. So I really like that. And she mentioned about how senior people, it can be very lonely, and how sometimes senior people don't necessarily have the same sort of support network within organizations. And she referenced the Ruby Wax book, where she said Ruby Wax almost said find somebody who's sort of got the same kind of issues going on that you have, because they'll be more understanding to talk about it. So maybe the same holds true. If you're a senior person, find another senior person either within or outside of your organization who has similar kind of battles, struggles at times going on, and use each other as a sounding board. But just talk to each other.
That's great. So we've got sort of the first point there around making sure from a business leader's perspective that you're taking this seriously, you're showing some vulnerability, you've got the support processes in place. Your point 2 there was really about taking responsibility as individuals, whether you are a business leader or you're a team member, in terms of, taking responsibility for your own mental well-being, taking advantage of what's out there within your business, calling for this sort of stuff if you need it, and talking to people. And I think a third point I'd probably take out of that, we're trying to strip it down to basics, is, Louise talked about the importance of sleep in there. And I think often a decent night's sleep, if you can get it, a decent night's sleep is works wonders. I look back on some of the things that I've read and heard from the GP Rankin Chatterjee. He often talks about just bringing it back to basics a lot of the time. If you are suffering a bit, then get some sleep, but also don't ignore some of the basics like decent hydration, nutrition, bit of exercise, bit of fresh air. A lot of these things are free or certainly cheap. Look at that and sort of do a little bit of a self-audit and try and don't ignore the restoration that sleep brings, and don't be shy in having a quick nap if that's what you need, a power nap early afternoon or whatever else, just to freshen your mind. Because I don't know about you, Mark, but often if you're dwelling on an issue, often it looks quite a lot different in the morning than it did the night before.
Absolutely. Through some fresh eyes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just recharging the batteries, isn't it? A lot of the time, certainly for some of this stuff we're talking about, the more serious end of it, of
clearly
clinical depression, etc. I have no idea how effective it is, but for some of the people who are just feeling maybe a bit low, a bit more anxious, this sort of stuff really can make a difference. So brilliant. Yeah, great third point as well, James. So just to quickly wrap that up and summarize it, the first one you drew out from there, James, was all about making sure this is a top-down driven thing within organizations. So the leaders show vulnerability as well. It's driven culturally through the business. I then kind of built on that by talking about the point about just talking to somebody. Louise was saying, just talk to people, use the mechanisms which are in place, and just talk to people about it, but don't turn it into pity pies, because they can become counterproductive. And then the third point you said, which Louise brought out, is just the beauty of sleep on some of this as well, which can make such a difference. So I think, as you say, we could have had 300 points. We've got 3 really good points. Hope you all enjoyed listening to the show. James, I think I speak for both of us here. We found that absolutely fascinating and useful as well. There were some amazing points come out which we can all adopt and really learn from there.
Yeah, absolutely right on both counts. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Very grateful for Louise for sharing that value with us.
Absolutely. So a big shout and a big thank you to Louise for that. Louise Newby, thank you from 3egg. The links to everything Louise was talking about with regard to her contact details as well are going to be in the show notes. So we mentioned that earlier. Please take a look and reach out to Louise if you need to. Leaves us to say, if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us. If you didn't, well, you can anyway, but we'd prefer it. And that wraps up today's show, and we'll see you all next week.
Great stuff. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, James. Bye, everybody.